Hey everybody, and welcome back to another devlog for my game Alien Frontier. This is the second ever devlog, and if you're coming into this new, I recommend just jumping back and taking a look at the first one where I go over the game. As for today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the art style of the game, how I arrived to it, and what exactly I did to implement it. So let's face it, graphics in video games are very important, even for indie devs. As much as we'd like to believe that you can put up a game on Steam with really simple programmer art and people will just love it and play it because of the depth of the gameplay, truth is that's not really how it happens. When browsing through Steam, most customers only spend a few seconds on a page, and what dictates their interest in a game or not is the trailer and the screenshots. They don't really care about how well balanced the game is, how deep the mechanics are. It's really about that first impression. It's all about the looks.
Nice.
But this is really difficult for solo developers like myself. How can we compete with these big AAA games that look so good? Well, truth is, we can't. So that's why so many indie games have a stylized look, and mine is no exception. So pull up a seat, put on your finest smoking jacket, and let's take a look at the graphics of Alien Frontier. So it's really common to see indie games with non-realistic art styles. A lot of them are very stylized, pixel art is really popular, and it makes a lot of sense because making a game with AAA quality visuals takes hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, and indie games, kind of by definition, do not operate on that scale. But there's a bit of misconception that stylized graphics are easy, and there's an even bigger misconception that stylized graphics don't need to look good. And that isn't really true. If you think of the best looking indie games with stylized graphics, you're probably thinking about games like Hades or games like Disco Elysium, and those games are also the result of a lot of artistry. So it's more than just making pixel art and calling it a day. You need to have a good look to it. So what is something that can be done to make stylized art look good? Well, in my opinion, one of the most important things is actually the art direction, and more specifically, the consistency. Art direction isn't just about choosing what style to use, but it's about ensuring that everything maintains a consistent look and style, from the tone, the colors, all the way down to the line widths. For example, a game like Binding of Isaac actually does have quite simple art, but I don't think anyone would ever call it bad. And a big part of that is because everything is consistent. All the assets fit together, everything works well. It's a cohesive product. So that just goes to show that stylized games don't necessarily need to be intricately detailed like some of the best of the best. They need to have a consistent visual style that works well cohesively. So that's the most important thing I felt I needed to know when I was building the art style of this game. And after all,
knowing is half the battle.
With that in mind, I decided to think about what sort of tone I wanted with the art style of my game, and also some of the more practical sides. Since I'm a solo developer, I can't really do highly detailed stylized art like a lot of other really high quality indie games. But at the same time, being a 3D game, it needed to be clear and readable and needed to have a certain level of quality. My game has a very kind of vibrant and zany tone to it. It's not a super serious game, so I was naturally drawn to the style of Mobius and other sci-fi comic books of that era. These things are defined by clear, bold colors, a real lack of shading, and also very well-defined outlines. And with that in mind, I began to experiment and build out my visual style. Okay, so let's take a look and see how it's all done. So the look is primarily built using post-process materials, and there are two materials in particular. Before we jump into the specifics, I want to show off what things look like without my post-process effects. So here we have with post-process, and here we have without.
What the hell is even that?
Yeah, so it's pretty bright, but I'll get into that in a second. But you can see that the biggest thing that happens is the color gets really flattened down. The brightness is obviously greatly reduced, and we have outlines. So I'll show those two things, how they work in conjunction as well. So as you can see, it is pretty bright and pretty drastically different. In this view, we can take a look and notice that the materials themselves are incredibly simple. Most of them are just flat, textureless colors, and the models that do have textures are very simple. There's not much detail, there's no normal maps, very simple, which is really good for my development time. I can just primarily focus on flat colors and really simplistic textures. So the first part of the post-process look is flattening the colors. So here's what everything looks like with the colors flattening on. And already it goes a long way. So the vibrancy comes back, it becomes a whole lot more readable. And you'll notice there is some shadows, but for the most part, it's a very flat image. And then when I apply the outline, it really kind of ties everything together and provides that depth, as you can see here. So first things first, let's take a look at the coloring. Now, it's a little hard to see with everything off, but with lighting applied to the scene, you get things like little gradients because the light casts shadows, it makes things brighter, more exposed, some other things are darker, and even a flat color like this rock all of a sudden takes on a whole bunch of different shades and textures. And that's not really what I want with this art style. So the first thing I set out to do was to flatten the lighting in the scene and reduce this range of colors and gradients into one or two really bold colors. All right, so this is the post-process material I have that handles the colors. And I'm gonna break it down into a few different parts. Now, this is not going to be a full tutorial. I'm just going to go over just the key highlights just for time's sake. But if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to answer them in the comments. So for those unfamiliar, a post-process material is a function that is run on every pixel you see on screen and then modified and applied. So I'll dive into what I'm doing here. Now, the most important part of this material is the scene texture node. Basically what this is this returns the different data of the pixel based on what channel essentially I choose to go through.
I know some of these words.
So right here I have a diffuse color channel, and let me just hook this up and let's take a look at what this returns. So this is what we see here. Diffuse is essentially the unlit version of the scene. So this is the flat colors, which I'm essentially after. I'm just looking at the raw texture data. I don't really care about how the shadows interact with things. I don't care about how light interacts with things. So this is a big step, but it still looks really flat. And a big part of that is there are no shadows at all. And in my references, I still want some shadows. This just looks way too cartoony. So what I need to do next is essentially make my own manual shadows. So what I have here is I'm taking the diffuse color and I'm taking the regular scene after all the lighting, I'm desaturating it and I'm dividing them together to essentially get what I like to call a shadow map. So this is what the scene looks like when the shadow map is applied. It kind of looks like the weird Wraith world in Lord of the Rings. Now this map is a little bit inverted. The areas of white are darker areas, and the kind of grayer areas are areas that are more exposed to light. So you can see this building here casts a really distinct shadow. So this is all white. Same thing with the characters here, and also there are parts of the rock which provide a little bit of darkness. Now the cool thing about post-process materials is that you can have conditional statements like this if statement here that can determine what to display or what to do with a pixel based on the data. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the shadow map, so to speak, and I'm plugging it into this input A. And now I also have another parameter which I call shadow min, which is my input. So what's happening is it's checking the intensity levels of these shadows. And now based on that, it's either going to do one or two things. It's either going to do the diffuse color, which is just the really flat version of what you see, or I've created a shadow version, which is really just the same as the diffuse color, but tinted a little bit. So for this, I'm essentially taking the previous flat version, but I'm darkening it. I'm multiplying it by a dark gray tint. Here's what it looks like. So you can see it doesn't look too different, but it is significantly darker. And you can really see the difference of the two when they're combined. So now what I'm doing is I am taking the areas of dark shadow, which are represented by the white here, and I'm essentially cutting it out. I'm replacing it with the dark tint version of my scene. Everything else gets the regular tint of my scene. And this is the result. So what we have here is the combined versions of the two. We have the regular tint in pretty much all of it, but I have some shadows, which adds depth to the rocks behind. There's a little bit on the terrain. Shadows are cast by my characters. And looking at the buildings over here, we get the shadows too. Now the cool thing about that is I can really tune a lot of these things. I can tune the threshold of how much or how little shadow I want, and also the color of the shadows. So I can make the shadows super dark if I wanted, or I can make them almost imperceptible. I can even give them their own hue or tint. I don't really know why I would do this, but it's kind of cool to have that option. And then up next is the outline material. So remember, post-process material checks every pixel that's being rendered, and it runs these calculations on those pixels. So what I'm doing here is I'm checking the center pixel, so the original pixel, and then I'm checking the pixels to each adjacent side, and I'm getting the pixel depth from it. Long story short, pixel depth is how far the pixel is from the current camera. I make sure this value is a positive, and then I'm multiplying it and running against a few other custom parameters, which I'll show in a second, and then I get a value between 0 and 1 out of that. So basically what this is doing is checking the edges of every pixel, and if the pixel is a certain depth away, I consider it an edge. Now if it's an edge, it's going to return a value of 1. This 0 to 1 value is fed into a lerp, which determines whether to render the post-process scene texture or the color black. So basically what this is a lerp chooses between two things, and it uses a value called the alpha, which is a scale of 0 to 1 to determine how far to go between them. So if this value is a 0, I'm showing the post-process input 0, which is just the scene after all the post-processing, so it's just regular. But if this value is 1, I'm showing the color black. And what this is doing is this is checking if a pixel is on the edge of something, color it black. Otherwise, don't care. So that's how we get the outlines. Now I mentioned I have some parameters on here. So here I can set the size of the outline, but I can also set those other parameters such as the sensitivity. And this essentially determines how far away does something have to be considered an edge. So these set how far away from the camera and the original pixel does something have to be considered an edge. I also have other parameters that set the size of the outlines, so I can make them really intense or barely perceptible. So you see, if I decrease that threshold, it becomes way more sensitive to even the smallest gaps and details, which, this is a little overboard. Now you might notice that this node has been duplicated a few different times. And I want to talk about Unreal's secret weapon, which is custom stencil depth. Custom stencil is a data buffer which allows a designer to give a 0 to 255 numerical value onto an object. And our post-process material can get the value of that custom stencil. So it's checking every pixel and it's checking what the value is. By default, this is off, but we can assign numbers to them. I actually have multiple versions of the outline with different thresholds and different thicknesses and other values, and I can use different tunings because of that. So if I set this rock to 0, we have the default outline, which isn't very noticeable. But if I change this value to 2, you see it immediately starts popping out because I'm telling it to use the second set, which is a lot more sensitive. I save this tuning for things like characters or enemies, but additionally, if I set the custom value to something like 10, 10 is essentially my ignore everything value. Now it has no outline at all. So this is really useful for things like smoke or other things where I don't want to have those custom values. So the outline really adds a lot, as you can see. It adds depth that the color can't quite have. And these two things combined really bring the scene together.
That rug really tied the room together, did it not?
And with that, I'll call it a day. This was a quick overview of the post-processing and shader work done in Alien Frontier. I hope it wasn't too technical and boring, and hopefully there's something you learned from it or provided some inspiration. I just wanted to take a quick moment to say thanks to everyone who watched and commented on the previous devlog. I was pretty blown away. I wasn't really expecting many people to watch the video, and it really exceeded my expectations, and the comments were really great. So, if you have any other questions or thoughts, feel free to drop them below because I do read every one of the comments, and I'm hoping I get to discuss the game more with you guys. And of course, if you like this video, feel free to subscribe. And more importantly, if you think the game looks interesting or you want to support me, please consider wishlisting the game on Steam. But if you don't think you're quite ready to wishlist, totally fair. And good news, I have a demo that should be coming out soonish. I'm putting the finishing touches on things, and I've got a really special announcement to make regarding that. So hopefully by the time the next devlog goes up in 2 to 3 weeks, I have some cool news to share. So keep your eyes peeled. All right, that's it for now. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.